Welcome to the Minelab Expert Series. Dive into the world of metal detecting with us as we tackle both its basics and intricacies, all while posing tough questions to the Minelab engineers themselves. Join us in this thrilling quest beneath the surface of metal detecting. Hello, welcome back. Today we're with Mark, Phil and Paul again from Minelab and Crawfords. Hello. We're really deep diving into some tech today and we're going to be talking about multi-IQ. So multi-IQ, I've heard about it, I know it's on the detector that I use and I've seen it on my friends' detectors. Can you describe what it is in a simple term and how it, maybe even how it came to be?
Absolutely. So I'll probably go back to what we were talking a few episodes ago where we were talking about how single frequency detectors behave. Essentially, the transmitter from the detector creates eddy currents in the target. Those eddy currents in the target then generate a magnetic field that is detected by the detector. Those eddy currents in the target are created differently depending on whether the target is a high conductor or a low conductor, and that's how we do our discrimination. But it also means that the frequency that a target will respond can vary depending on that conductivity. And so a low frequency target is best detected by a low frequency detector, and a high frequency target is best detected by a high frequency detector. So one of the things that multi-IQ does for us is it's got multiple frequencies. It's running those low frequencies at the very same time that it's running the high frequencies. So you can detect with maximum sensitivity, with maximum depth, both the low frequency targets, the high conductors, and the low conductors, the high frequency targets, at the same time. One great analogy that Mark came up with is like fishing with multiple fish hooks. You've got multiple opportunities to hook that target because you're running several frequencies at the same time. You effectively have a much greater bandwidth in your detector, and it gives you a lot more response from a broader range of targets.
And one more small subtlety in that analogy is the fish hooks are different sizes. So you can catch the big fish at the same time you're catching the little fish.
I like that, that's good.
So it saves you having to scan the ground several times with several different frequencies to make sure that you've gotten everything out of that ground.
Yeah, so if you look back over a decade ago when people predominantly were using single frequency detectors, they might go over a patch of ground, and then at the end of that, if they suddenly realise they're finding maybe some larger targets, they might actually have to change coils or change detectors or change settings and then go back over it again and actually redetect it. So obviously that gets pretty tedious pretty quickly.
Yeah, and so that's one of the simpler things that multi-IQ gives you. But multi-IQ, as we talked about in the ground balance episode, has a lot of power to minimise ground effects, etc.
Yeah, so as we touched on in the previous video, if you've got shallow targets in mineralised ground, pretty easy to detect with a single frequency detector, but as soon as you start getting that target dropping away and most of the signal that your detector is having to deal with is from the ground, or the ground noise, you start losing your targets. Basically the ID will start drifting away from what it should be, or the ID starts bouncing around, which we call unstable target IDs. All of that equates to you as a user struggling to make the decision, do I dig this? The way that multi-IQ and simultaneous multi-frequency gets around that is it basically is sending more frequencies into the ground simultaneously. What that allows the computer engine inside the detector to do is to compare the signals coming back from each one of those frequencies, and it can actually look at, all of the frequencies have got ground noise in them that's the same, therefore I know what that is now, it's more information, I can take that out. So we have some smart algorithms that basically subtract out the ground in a more effective way than just doing a ground balance. And as a result, your target IDs are much more stable, and your ability to say, I'm going to dig that, goes up. So it just translates into more targets found per hour in a day that you go out detecting.
Do you think that's why when multi-IQ came out with the Equinox, people that had detected certain fields a long time all of a sudden said the fields have come back to life because now that they've got all the frequencies. They're not using the single frequency on the same field.
That is definitely one of the factors. There's a lot of reasons why multi-IQ and Equinox has been a success. I mean, it's a fast detector, so it has great target separation. It also handles the ground, and a lot of people don't realise that their favourite spot they go detecting on a weekend actually has a bit of ground noise, and that their targets have been masked by that ground noise. So what I mean by masked is it's covered up.
Some of the targets that people thought were trash, or the detector was marking as trash, now have got a stable ID and are being detected as good targets, and so diggable.
Yeah.
I'm imagining all these frequencies coming out of the detector, and they're all going into the ground. And I'm sorry, but I'm using the music metaphor again. I'm imagining them like people in a band, like a guitarist, a bass player, and a drummer and a singer. You hear it as one. You hear that band. How does the information go into the ground and then come back and not just be a mix?
Maybe a good analogy for you, again music related, is you know what a graphic equalizer is that you might have in your car or on your home stereo. So you can basically dial in, I only want to hear the high frequency, or I only want to hear the low frequency. Basically a modern metal detector that's simultaneous multi-frequency has separate graphic equalizers that are extracting just the bit they care about listening to, and that sort of creates the separation that can then be used by the algorithm.
So it's very segregated. There's no chance of them blending. Okay.
I mean, that's part of designing a good detector, is that good extraction and separation, and then secondarily what you do with it.
That's good. Thank you.
And our single frequency machine is basically you've just got the one slider. So that's why you have to go back over a spot with the slider in a different spot. And so it's the advantage of simultaneous multi-frequency. You don't have to go back and adjust the sliders each time. It just does it for you.
Was it quite difficult designing where those bands would be?
Well, step one is hire some PhD scientist people. Let them tinker with it for many years doing R&D and pay for it. And then they have a good understanding of the trade-offs, because it's not as simple as just saying, dialing in what you want. You've actually got to trade off, okay, that might add more noise, or that'll make from the ground, or it might add more noise from the environment, or you might introduce some unwanted effect, or maybe it just doesn't even work. Like it's not obvious how to do this, and it's sort of the art of designing a great detector.
There's all sorts of trade-offs, right from how many frequencies you choose to operate with, to what those frequencies are, to how much power you put in each of those frequencies. There's a lot of different elements to toy with, and they've each got their own trade-offs. So there's a fair bit of work that's required and a fair bit of experience to understand exactly what those trade-offs are and what the unintended consequences are if you make a particular decision. So yeah, fair bit of effort.
And you could, another aspect to it as well, is a single frequency detector in a sense is a lot easier to design, because you're dealing with one frequency and receiving just that frequency, and you can put all your, let's say, effort into making that good. As soon as you're dealing with multiple frequencies, I guess going back to what your intuition was there, Scott, it gets harder to separate them but still have that performance of the signal from the target and reducing the noise from everything else. So it's a harder game making a simultaneous multi-frequency detector.
There's all sorts of odd effects. One, for example, is that higher frequencies tend to have less noise. Lower frequencies tend to draw a lot more power. So, but you still want each of those elements in to the right degree. So you've got to trade off all of those elements again.
The next thing I'd like to talk about is ignoring salt water. So one of the hallmarks of a good simultaneous multi-frequency detector is it works at the beach a lot better than a single frequency detector. So I'll just quickly recap. A single frequency detector usually uses what's called a special type of ground balance to operate at the beach. As I alluded to in the previous video, when you do a ground balance, you can sometimes get a lot of mechanical bumps, and like whacking the ground and shell grit can actually turn into large signals that the user has to deal with. A lot of modern single frequency detectors actually mask that over, so they pretend that that's not happening and it's not there, so the user thinks they're having a great experience on the beach. What the user doesn't realise with some of those detectors is that the detector's having to spend a lot of effort ignoring those big bumps and those noises going on under the hood, and that basically turns into you ignoring some of the targets in the ground. So you just won't find as much with a single frequency detector, no matter how great it is. It just doesn't have enough information because it doesn't have multiple frequencies to do a good job of getting rid of the salt. So that leads on to multi-IQ and simultaneous multi-frequency. What it can do is put in multiple frequencies into the wet sand, and particularly at the beach, it's the wet sand that causes issue. Dry sand, basically, with no water in it, the salt doesn't really have an effect, and so it's just like detecting on sand.
The effect from the salt is due to the conductivity because of that salt. So if you've got dissolved salt in water, that's quite conductive, whereas if you've got dry salt in sand, it's really not that conductive. So dry sand really isn't seen as a salty environment.
Yeah, so what we can do with multi-IQ is say, okay, the salt signal that Phil was just talking about, which is sort of conductive, comes through as a conductive signal, it exists at quite a high frequency, so we can actually dedicate one of our frequencies to just handling the salt, and then we have an algorithm that basically cancels that out, and what you end up with is a detecting experience where you're no longer detecting the salt, and that's not interfering with everything, and you can just focus on getting great target IDs at depth.
That's really cool.
The algorithm is a process for doing things, and in our case, it's a lot of maths.
So that's your dedicated beach mode on your beach 2 mode on the Equinox, and also on the CTX 3030 you've got the saltwater setting as well.
In the Vanquish, we try and make it easy for users, and so that detector is looking out for those salt signals all the time, just to make that step easier for people starting in the hobby.
The main thing that the Vanquish is changing between the modes is the recovery speed is varying. They're all basically the same sort of beach mode under the hood.
So that's that salt water thing is there all the time, as you said.
Yeah. So we chose that for Vanquish just to make it the most versatile and approachable detector you could have out of the box without having to know the details.
And that's perfect. That is perfect for like me. I'm an example of that.
The user doesn't have to make decisions that they don't necessarily understand.
One thing that we've struggled to get into the public mind space is that concept of, particularly with Vanquish, where you don't have a ground balance. The multi-IQ gives you actually more discrimination depth. So a lot of people will do air depth tests on the bench and show, oh, my detector goes this deep, but they never go to the effort of burying targets in the ground to see that depth drops considerably. And then they still don't go to the next step, which is to compare the single frequency detector to a multi-frequency.
And even then, when they start doing target tests at depth, they're looking at detection. They're not looking so much at discrimination, and that's something that multi-IQ gives you really well, is those stable IDs at depth and in mineralised ground.
Because it's very easy to even do some of those experiments, but you now know that there's a target there. And so because you've got that prior knowledge, you can make any detector look good because it'll beep. But really you should be looking and looking at the IDs and seeing that they're stable, so the numbers aren't jumping around. You should be looking that the number's the right number, and you should be making sure that what you're hearing is the sound that would make you choose to dig it. There's handling the ground, there's handling salt, but there's also things just like handling rusty objects and iron and how well you do that. And this can be quite challenging because the number of things you're now having to manage and trade off. You've got multiple frequencies, you've got ground, you've got salt, but you've also got, it has to operate fast in amongst trash and have good target separation. But also it needs to not false, which is the word we use for getting a signal we don't want on a large iron, for example. And so you'll see there's a feature in Equinox called iron bias, which is really a dial that we give the user to set where they want to hear iron or not. Some people don't want to hear any iron, which is quite similar to how like a CTX historically is set up. And then other detectors, a lot of single frequency detectors have been configured also historically to like basically make the user dig up everything. And so there's really a spectrum of letting the user choose how much they want to dig up when they go out in a day. The reason you would want to dig up more iron is because it can sometimes be that a coin's right next to iron, and if you just had it set such that it would dig up lots of iron, you've just increased your probability of getting those hard to find coins. So there's a good reason for it. And so iron bias is just, I guess, an example of where a lot of R&D effort has gone to make a particular control give that user that configurability to make them as productive as they want to be, depending on their inclination. Some people still just want to have iron bias turned up reasonably high, and they're happy to ignore some of those trickier signals, but they know they're on a fresh patch where nobody has been before, so they can be a bit more ruthless and just go for the easier signals. So.
Iron bias is kind of one of the most popular questions that I get asked. How high do you have it, or how low? It's a function that's been put on for you to use. So I always say, you know, if you don't want to dig iron, turn your iron bias up till you get used to your detector, right. And then as you get more used to it, you can lower it and lower it and lower it. Again, it's all coming down to, if you've got it that low and you're in iron and that, it can spoil your experience. That's the last thing you want. You know, if you've got a function there that's going to help you, then use it. It's not being put on for show.
I think that's something that's came up in the ground balance video as well, is being comfortable first, getting experienced at detecting with a certain detector.
Exactly. As you start to learn the sounds, the nuance of the audio for ferrous and non-ferrous and very close targets, you start doing a lot of discrimination in your head, so you can start turning that iron bias down and start making those determinations where they're a lot trickier yourself.
Yeah, and I think we talked earlier about like some of the reasons why Equinox has been so successful, and one of those is that we realise people actually want to dig a bit more iron, and so all the defaults that we have in Equinox actually have the iron bias fairly low, to enable people to just dig a little bit more unwanted stuff, but on balance, at the end of the day, they've dug up more good stuff.
I was just going to ask, FBS2, did that evolve into multi-IQ? You know, like the frequencies on the CTX 3030, you have a lot more frequencies.
They're very different. They're very different beasts. There's some comparison in the algorithms in the background, but the way the transmitter and the receiver works is very different.
I mean, they are both simultaneous multi-frequency detectors as a big umbrella.
Multi-IQ has a lot more control over what those frequencies are and how much power is put into each frequency, and the combinations of those frequencies are a lot more controllable.
You could almost say that FBS2 and its predecessors are more analog in a sense, and multi-IQ is more digital, which has got lots of benefits in terms of being able to put those algorithms that R&D engineers, scientists come up with onto the detector. They have more versatility because they've got more information at their fingertips. It also means we can miniaturize it because you're putting more of it into a digital processor. So your printed circuit board's a bit smaller and lighter, and as we know, lots of people these days cares about size, weight and power in a metal detector.
Where do you see the next stage of multi-IQ going? Like how can it get, if it's already searching on multiple frequencies and giving us like so much more information, where else can we go from there?
Multi-IQ can get better. For us, the Equinox was our first version of multi-IQ, and it took some years of development to get there. And even in the later stages of development, you start to learn more. So, you know, we've learnt more since Equinox, and so I would expect that multi-IQ is going to improve.
Across all of the series of videos, one major takeaway you can have is that different targets look different at different frequencies. So just remember that. Remember that depending on what you're looking for, it is going to respond differently. Also, you know that you can trust a Minelab detector to be handling all of those different target sizes and nuances at the same time. And the simultaneous multi-frequency detectors actually are putting more into the ground in terms of different frequencies, and they're getting lots more information back. And it's all that extra information that gives us the ability to come up with a more accurate interpretation of what's in the ground. And I think finally we touched on, you know, it's all well and good to do that, but it actually takes a lot of skill and R&D history and great engineering and product design to get that extra information and turn it into stable IDs at depth so the user knows whether to dig or not.
I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Minelab. I want to thank Mark and Phil for giving their time for this series. Thank you so much. For Paul for being with us. And yeah, just thank you so much for sharing the stuff that you guys have. It's so great to have an inside link with people that have built these machines. And yeah, just it's been so insightful even for me as a relative newcomer, and I think a lot of people will take a lot of value from this content, like giving that kind of a bit more of a scientific basis of the stuff they're using week in, week out, and maybe have been for years. So thank you very much.